Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. We will now continue with part 2 of chapter 36. They quickly rematerialized in a large, dimly lit room. As Will's vision cleared, he saw that the chamber was roughly circular, a many-sided polygon, with tall bookshelves faceting the walls. It was sparsely furnished, a large round table near the center of the room, and a single comfortable chair facing a small fireplace, dark and cold, against the far wall. There were no windows, nor did Will see a door. "A bit gloomy in here," Jeremy remarked. The 2 lamps on the table, as well as the sconces spaced along the walls between the rows of books, gradually grew brighter. The dead hearth came to life and began to glow, spreading soft amber light through the room. "That's better," he said. "Your library?" Will asked, glancing around him. Hundreds of volumes packed the shelves that rose from the floor to the vaulted ceiling, nearly 20 feet above their heads. "Yes," he answered. "My collection." "Are all of these books real?" Emily inquired. "In the sense that they all contain information," Jeremy replied. "Most are relics. Others are accurate copies. None are simply decorative creations." "How did you manage to acquire them?" Will asked him. "Various ways," he said. "Mainly through friends and associates. Some I have copied myself." Will walked to the nearest wall and began examining the titles on the shelves. It was an eclectic collection, and seemed randomly arranged. "Are these what you've been reading recently?" asked Emily, stepping over to the central table, where a small stack of books sat between the oil-filled lamps. "Yes," he said. "I was doing some research." "May I?" Jeremy nodded. "Be my guest," he answered. Emily picked up one of the books and looked at the spine. "Interesting," she said. "Classical mythology." Hearing this, Will crossed the room and joined her as she opened the cover and began paging through the book. "Look, Will," she said. "Iris is in here." "What does it say about her?" he asked, peeking over her shoulder. The book was open to a page that listed and gave short descriptions of various gods and goddesses. Emily set the book down in front of them and pointed to one of the lines. "Iris," she read aloud, "primarily known as the goddess of rainbows, also a messenger goddess." "Is this how you figured out who she was?" she asked Jeremy. "It helped confirm what I had surmised," he replied. "I don't see Alicia listed," she remarked, flipping through the pages. "How could she be?" said Jeremy. "She had not yet been born." "But here's Eris," she noted. "Goddess of discord." It goes on to say that she prompted an argument between 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, which led to the judgment of Paris and the resulting Trojan War. Quite a resume. Which led Will to wonder and posed Jeremy the question, Are these stories true? Which stories are you talking about? He asked. The ancient myths, said Will. All of them. Any of them. You told me that divine beings rarely show themselves, and when they do, they try to be as unobtrusive as possible. But in these stories, they're present everywhere, interfering in everything. Myth is not history, Jeremy asserted. It is a record of how people explain the world and their place in it, the invisible causes, the ultimate reasons. The gods are often blamed or given credit for things by default, when there are no other explanations, or when men want to shift the responsibility from themselves. At the same time, he continued, as I have come to understand and believe, the gods and goddesses were, in the distant past, more active in the waking world. Even in Homer's day, when belief in the reality of divine beings was strong, it was generally acknowledged that the gods were steadily withdrawing from the world of men. Why? Asked Will. What changed? Jeremy walked over to the fireplace and stood with his hands on the back of the stuffed chair, looking into the low, rolling flames. The world changed, he said. He then stepped in front of the chair, and as he sat, 2 more chairs materialized, one on either side of the hearth. Taking this as an invitation, Will and Emily joined him at the fire, where they took seats, facing each other, while Jeremy fueled his pipe. The world changed, he repeated, striking a match against the sole of his boot. After staring for a moment at the small flame, he lit the pipe, tossed the spent match into the fire, then leaned back his head and began blowing long, undulating ribbons of smoke into the air. Because people changed? Will asked, gently encouraging Jeremy to continue. Yes, to some degree, he replied. At one time, the border between the literal and the metaphorical was less clearly defined. Our understanding of the world, and thus our description of it, tended to be more poetic. The human mind evolved from responsive to reflective. A responsive mind can accept, can coexist peaceably with a more fluid reality. But a reflective mind cannot. A reflective mind dwells on a single reality, reinforcing it with each reflection. It is useful in establishing a consistent reality. It is practical in many ways. But it creates boundaries, limits choices. Jeremy paused and puffed for a while in his pipe. Then, without prompting, he continued. Imagine that you must travel to a neighboring town, he said. You know the general direction and distance, but you must cross through densely wooded territory with no trails, nothing to indicate the best way to get there. You have a variety of options, but you must choose one and then make your own path. You might wander off course or encounter unforeseen obstacles and have to retrace your steps. But eventually, you find your way to the town. Now, let us say you must make the same trip every week. You might try a few different routes, hoping to discover a quicker, easier, or more scenic way to get to your destination. Of course, this would mean creating a new path each week, trampling down the undergrowth, breaking low branches, cutting through briars. Over time, what do you suppose would happen? After a long pause and a look from Jeremy, Will realized he was meant to answer. Well, he said, sooner or later, I would probably decide that one route was better than the others, and then I'd start going that way every time, or at least more often. Yes, that would be reasonable, said Jeremy. And as you continued to take the same path, what would be the result? I suppose the trip would become easier, Will replied. I'd know where I was going and what to expect. I wouldn't worry about getting lost. And if I kept using the same trail week after week, it wouldn't become overgrown. In fact, with continued use, it would gradually get wider and even easier to follow. And the other paths, said Jeremy, the ones you traveled before but no longer used, would you still have the option to take them? I would still have the option, Will answered, but since one path is now so much clearer than the others, it wouldn't make as much sense to use them. Indeed, said Jeremy. And we want the world to be sensible. We want a dependable path to follow. But what do we lose in the process? This, you see, is how one possible reality becomes the dominant one, by reaffirming it. Will now began to see the point of Jeremy's parable. Imagine now, he went on, that another traveler, faced with the same options, comes along. He finds a trail ready-made and wilderness. What route is he most likely to choose? He would probably follow the path he saw, said Will. Would he even consider doing otherwise? Jeremy asked. Perhaps, but not unless he was the particularly adventurous type. And what of the next traveler? And the next? In effect, each new traveler would have less of a choice. For what would be the result of an increasing stream of travelers taking the same path, day after day, year after year? The footpath would become a road, then a highway. What began as one possible route eventually becomes the only sensible one to take. Here Jeremy paused, giving Will and Emily a minute to absorb his words. After filling the air with fresh smoke, he took the pipe from his lips, studied it for a moment, then looked to his left. A table, he murmured, whereupon a small wooden table with a marble top appeared next to the arm of his chair. He set his pipe down on the conjured piece of furniture and, following a long, measured breath, continued. The reality of that world, the waking world, was once far less rigid, but over many millennia, with more and more humans filling the world, their minds constantly reaffirming an ever smaller set of possibilities, reality hardened. Boundaries became less permeable and more difficult to cross in both directions. He stared at the fire, or through it, as if picturing his thoughts. This is how the world changed. And that concludes part 2, and we will return with part 3.